These people cannot be persuaded. They cannot be reasoned with. They are on a power trip. I am very pleased to see what Ron DeSantis has been doing in Florida. You just make these laws and you cut off the money. You know, these radicals that come in, they don't have the right to transform education and to teach their propaganda.
Welcome to the New Flesh Podcast, the podcast you deserve. My name is Ricky Allpike, and joining me is my good friend, Mr. Jonathan Astro. Astro, how are you? It's Black History Month.
It is. What are you saying? Are you accusing me of not caring about Black History Month? Is that what you're saying? Maybe I care about it more than you do.
I think you might, but I think our next guest also cares about it, who is a historian. So Mary Grabar is back to talk history with us.
All right, let's do it. Mary Grabar earned her PhD from the University of Georgia and taught college English for 20 years. She's a resident fellow at the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization in Clinton, New York. She first spoke to us about her most recent book, Debunking the 1619 Project, Exposing the Plan to Divide America, in June 2022. That's episode 115 for those interested. She's also the author of Debunking Howard Zinn, a book we'll be discussing at length today. Mary, welcome back to the New Flesh.
Well, thanks for having me. It's good to be back.
You've written a new piece for the American Spectator titled Why Black History Month Ignores the Author of the Most Talked About Column in Negro America. It's about someone I'd never heard of, a writer called George Schuyler. Am I pronouncing that right?
Skyler.
What is the idea behind this latest piece?
Yeah, well, I originally came up here to the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization, where I sit right now. In the summer of 2011, I spent a month here. I was still teaching in Georgia, in Atlanta, Georgia, and I had a research fellowship for a month, and I went to Syracuse University, which is about 35 miles from here, almost every day, and looked at the papers of George Schuyler. So I have been working on a biography of him for 12 years now. I've had, taken time out because I've written two other books and, have done other things, including writing for money in the meantime. And I am still working on the biography, finishing it up. Don't have a publisher for it yet. But he is a topic that I feel very passionately about because he was basically pushed down into the memory hole of American history. So here you have this guy who was incredibly popular and controversial, almost like the equivalent of, say some talk show host that, who's a household name and people argue and debate about his opinions. So, and that's the way he was described by Melvin Tolson about, the way Harlem looked at him. So George Schuyler grew up in Syracuse, New York, where his papers are, and did 2 stints in the Army, in the segregated Army, and eventually made his way to Harlem, where he started working for a socialist Black monthly magazine called The Messenger. And he became the most popular Black journalist in America in the 30s and the 40s. He was friends with H.L. Mencken. If you know about that great satirist, he was sort of the literary arbiter of American letters and, fiction. He made Theodore Dreiser. He sort of determined who was a good writer and who was not in terms of literature. Very influential, very controversial, and they were friends. So, and Schuyler's writing is just absolutely incredible. One of the things, when I was going through his papers, I don't know if you've ever done any archival research at a university, but they put you in this room, you're stripped of your belongings, lest you have a pen or something, you can only bring electronic devices. They give you pencils, they give you paper, and they look at you while you're going through these old papers sometimes that are falling apart. And it's like, it's a very dry, quiet experience. But I found myself laughing out loud so many times because he's so witty. He's just such a great stylist, such a great satirist. And so I'm hoping to bring attention back to him because he deserves it. He's one of our great American treasures.
And why do you think he's being overlooked?
Well, as I said in my American Spectator piece yesterday, it's because he was an anti-communist. So he was an anti-communist even while he was a socialist. And of course, the communists were trying to overthrow the socialists or anyone who was doing anything less than what they were doing. They wanted to dominate and take control of everything and, start a revolution. And so even when he was a socialist or, had that philosophy in the 1930s, he was speaking out and writing about what the communists were doing. And here in 1931, I don't know if you know about this case, it was called the Scottsboro case. And it was in Scottsboro, Alabama. And what happened was that there were, people riding the trains during the Depression, hopping on trains, hobos and stuff. And there were two young white women. And they had encountered a group of 9 young black men. Some of them were teenagers. And these women were in trouble. These young women were in trouble. And so what they did is that they accused these guys of rape. And they had this, what was typical in those days, a very quick trial, circus atmosphere, and they were sentenced to death. Except for one who was 13 years old and he was let off. But the communists made hay out of this. They actually prolonged the trial. They sabotaged it in order to get publicity. There were worldwide protests about the Scottsboro boys, and so the communists were fundraising off of this case. And the longer the case dragged on, the more money they would make. And I think they were hoping that they would get the electric chair because that would give them the publicity. And Skyler was enraged by this, as you can imagine. And, and he sort of knew the score of the communists. He knew that from the time he started writing in 1923. So a lot of our history today is rewritten with the communist perspective. So if you read about the civil rights movement, a lot of these historians will say the civil rights movement was really started by the communists. No, the communists were trying to start a revolution here, and African Americans would be sacrificed in that revolution. So it's the opposite. And so they don't want someone like Skyler disrupting their narrative.
Is it fair to say that the communist groups in the US at the time, or maybe even the Soviets overseas, were purposely trying to sow dissent amongst whites and blacks, and even in some cases to lure some black folks to Russia with this idea that it was a collectivist utopia?
Yes, absolutely. So they were recruiting, and part of my article goes into the case of Lovett Fort Whiteman, who was this young black man. He is known as the first black communist. And he was recruited to the Soviet Union, where he attended the school that they had to train these subversives. And he was bestowed all these honors. He even went to this one town, and they said they were going to rename this town. I forget the original name, but it was going to be White Mansky for White, for Lovett Fort Whiteman. And he came back, to Harlem. He started recruiting, got people to go over there. And of course, during the Depression, there were a number of white and Black Americans who went to the Soviet Union because they were promised jobs. Things were okay at the beginning, right? And especially for Blacks because they weren't used to being treated equally. So they put on this big show. But then the purges came, and Fort Whiteman was accused of being a Trotskyite, and there was this big meeting, and there were two Black communists there, James Ford and William Patterson. And James Ford was one of the young men that Love at Fort Whiteman had recruited. So, with the help of these two betrayers, Fort Whiteman was sent off to, I think it was someplace in Turkestan, and he first taught school, but then he was sent to a work camp and eventually, to the Gulag. And he was working on I think it's called the Kolyma Highway out in Siberia, where people slept in holes that they dug in the ice when it was 60 below. And he was killed, and and the cause of death was that he was starved and beaten because he did not fill his work quota. Now, Love at Fort Whiteman was an amateur actor and a boxing coach. He was a healthy man in his 30s, but as typical, he was starved and beaten to death. And that discovery was made in the 1990s by Harvey Clare and a couple co-authors in a book called The Soviet World of American Communism. As you know, that the Soviet records were opened briefly in the 1990s, and there was verification about what happened to Love at Fort Whiteman because people didn't know what happened to him. They suspected he disappeared, and he met his horrible death, in the cause that he had dedicated his life to.
Now, this erasure of Black voices who don't fit the revolutionary or radical mould still continues to this day. The valorization of figures like the Black Panthers and Angela Davis over Black American entrepreneurs, farmers, and professionals is quite striking. And I guess we could add George Floyd to the mix there. What exactly are Black people being told to resist or react against here?
Well, the underlying message is a Marxist message. It's history is twisted around in order to convey this idea that this system is unjust, it is still racist, that Black people are in certain respects still enslaved, and it's propaganda. It is intended to make a certain segment of our population feel hopeless, feel angry, hatred towards white people, and to eventually, start a revolution. I mean, it's exactly what Lenin, told the American communists to do in 1919 when they first set up office. It's to not to heal any kind of, racial wounds or to help in any kinds of frictions that might be there, but to exacerbate them for their own political purposes. And of course, every single communist revolution has been started with a civil war in a population. I mean, this is what they excel at. It happened in the country where I was born, Slovenia. It happened in Vietnam. It happens everywhere. You have brother against brother. You have citizen against citizen. And so the ultimate goal is to overthrow our form of government, the American form of government, and all democratic forms of government.
Mary, can we lump in Black History Month as one of these tools of the Marxist revolution?
Yes, absolutely. It's been overtaken. And as I noted in my article, when they had themes, this was started with Black History Week in 1926 by Carter Woodson, a Black historian, and eventually became Black History Month. But as time goes on, you can see how the themes changed. So, ironically, as things are getting better, right, as Blacks have civil rights, as the wage gap is closing, as their opportunities are looking up, the themes are more pessimistic. And so in 1939, during the Depression, the theme is, Black accomplishment or something like that. And this year it's the resistance. So it's the opposite of the reality. And of course, the purpose of propaganda is to change reality in people's minds. It's to stir up feelings of discontent, resentment, and so forth. And so here, we now have many schools that have Black Lives at School Week. So for a whole week, they have daily lessons that promote the Black Lives Matter agenda. And of course, Black Lives Matter was founded by three women who were trained Marxists. I mean, they've said that.
And very rich women now, too.
Yes. Yeah.
Can I say? So, Mary, you mentioned that you originally came from Slovenia. Would you mind just giving us an insight into your personal history? Because we'd just like to hear about your early life, if you wouldn't mind.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, my parents brought me to this country when I was 2 years old. So they literally had to escape over into Austria. So they escaped to the other side of the border. And you had to have a sponsor back in those days. And there were 9 kids in my father's family. Now, my family were, of the peasant class, just, basic surviving farmers. And so a number of my father's siblings had gone to Canada and to America. And so one of his brothers in Rochester, New York, sponsored us. So I don't have any memories of growing up there, although I've taken a few subsequent trips back. One was in 1969 when I was a kid, and I could see the difference, in terms of the material benefits, no indoor plumbing of any of my relatives' houses at that time, things we took for granted they didn't have. And I could see the suppression, how my uncles would refuse to discuss politics with my father in their own homes. Okay, because they thought someone might overhear them and they'd be punished. So this was under Tito's communist regime. And of course, I heard stories growing up. It always seemed to be like people were escaping. It was, a matter of survival and hunger and, unequal treatment of people when you sought medical attention or if there was an accident or a crime that took place. So I've always been conscious of that and have been fascinated by how Americans could have been attracted to this philosophy that has harmed so many of my relatives and so many Slovenians. I mean, I think there are, this country's the size of New Jersey. I don't know how many unmarked mass graves there still are from the refugees in 1945 who were sent back. The countryside is literally surrounded or is Yeah, I mean, they're every place, these mass graves, unmarked. They're finally starting to, investigate them. But the communists, what they did is they just built these, dug out these huge pits, rounded up whole families, and shot them and buried them in these pits. And that's where a lot of the anti-communist Slovenians are buried.
Do you have any view on why people seem to know very little about the Soviet regime, Stalin, and communism in general?
They just don't teach it. They don't teach it. And, when I was teaching college still, I one year I was teaching a night class, and I think it was around 2004, and I was teaching a short story by Richard Wright, and I said, well, this was written during his communist years, and about a third of the class just were dumbfounded because they'd never heard the word. Most other students that I had who had heard the word automatically associated it with a Red Scare, like this was a figment of people's imaginations. I mean, that's what they'd been taught in high school. And so they aren't taught this. Our culture, downplays the horrors of communism, Nazism. Everyone knows that that's bad, right? But the communists actually killed more people than the Nazis did. Um, but you even have, people joining, the Communist Party. There are social democrats, uh, who adhere to that philosophy, and so it's not seen as something that is murderous, that has deliberately starved people to death, tortured people. It is seen as something benign, and that's simply because culturally, in books and in schools, people are just not taught the truth about it. And again, I go back to Skyler. That's, I think, the major reason why he has been pushed down the memory hole.
Before we dive headfirst into Howard Zinn, we have to ask you about a recent tweet by 1619 Project author Nicole Hannah Jones. Nicole Hannah Jones has stated that, quote, "We literally have people who are trying to legislate against the teaching of our history. Now by our history," she's talking about her 1619 project. Can you shed some light on this legislation that she's speaking of here?
Yeah, well, it's just a very clever ploy. So, they're calling these laws that have been passed, I think, in over half the states here against the use of the 1619 project in schools K through 12 as censorship. They're twisting it around. It's not censorship. You can go to any bookstore, you can go to Amazon, you can buy her books every place. You can watch the new documentary on Hulu. She is speaking all over the country. Libraries are hosting her, clubs are hosting her. She's on television. There's no censorship. What is simply being done is that there is an attempt at quality control on curriculum materials. These materials, the lessons for the 1619 project were just slipped into schools, without the usual process of, being reviewed and being written by educators. And it's illicit to begin with, but now they're cleverly calling it censorship. It's lies. It's not censorship at all. There's a set curriculum, and we don't teach Mein Kampf in schools as legitimate history, right? There would be objections to that. There would be objections to, sugarcoating slavery, in textbooks. There always is. and no one calls that censorship. So it's a bogus argument that they're making.
Is there a danger, Mary, that this legislation gives proponents, I suppose, these sort of libs of TikTok teachers that we see all the time, gives these people the idea that they're somehow old-fashioned martyrs, that they're being denied the ability to teach the truth?
Yeah. So you hear that all the time, and from Nicole Hannah-Jones, the creator of this project, especially. Uh, that we just want to teach the truth. And if you go to the Zinn Education Project, which is a nonprofit that distributes Howard Zinn's materials, they'll say, we're teaching the truth. And it's not the truth. But people have this, I think there's something about being radical and subversive that gives it the appearance of being the truth, right? Something that has been peer reviewed and tested through time, which is more likely to be the truth, is not seen that way. But that's, I think, because we have, it's because scholarship has been subverted. It's no longer, what was the consensus? We've studied this carefully. Scholars have gotten together. They've corrected each other on minor points, put it in footnotes and everything. Now it's, something that's completely radical and even anti-intuitive, but it's pushed and people fall for it. And the problem is also that education attracts radicals. It's hard to survive as an educator if you are interested in, teaching what is the truth, instead of, trying to mold students into little social justice warriors or into your own image of what you think these students should be.
So you mentioned the Hulu series that has just come out, this docu-series that was produced by Oprah Winfrey. It just got me thinking that elite leftists currently dominate the popular culture and institutions, which means that sort of establishment Hillary Clinton Democrats like Oprah can use their wealth and influence to create seriously slick products to get their message out. And let's not forget that the original publication was put out by the New York Times and given a Pulitzer Prize. The audience will be thinking, how could this possibly be wrong? And they'll be thinking, I trust Harpo Productions, the New York Times, and the Pulitzer. So to me, this seems like asymmetrical warfare, don't you think? I mean, what can be done to combat this kind of firepower?
Yeah, well, that's right. It is asymmetrical. And someone told me, who's sort of been on the front lines fighting these educational battles, they've got all the money, and they do. And, you've got Oprah. I remember when she had her show, she was not radical. She was mainstream. She'd have all these white women there, and they do the makeovers, and then they feel good about themselves. And she was like all American. And then Obama ran for president, and it's like she's supporting Obama, and now she's radical. I mean, it was a complete show that she put on. What can be done? Okay, well, we need to cut off the money. We just have to use political power. These people cannot be persuaded. They cannot be reasoned with. They are on a power trip. I am very pleased to see what Ron DeSantis has been doing in Florida. You just make these laws and you cut off the money. And, these radicals that come in, they don't have the right to transform education and to teach their propaganda. So it's warfare. We just have to fight them politically. We need to, make sure that there are alternatives in terms of education, to, have alternative schools with alternative curricula. I, would like to see more books being put out there that convey our point of view. And also the media. We need to get control of the media because they are, you know, you've probably heard about all the censorship here with, before Elon Musk bought Twitter and
Mm.
Facebook, and now we know that the State Department was funding this, and they're deplatforming conservative sites, saying that the American Spectator, where I just had my article published, was on this list that was, they had two lists, reliable and unreliable. And all the unreliable ones were conservative, as you can imagine. And taxpayers are paying for this. It's just got to stop. And, we just need to regain political power and cut this off. And that's what Trump was doing. I mean, he did it, towards the end of his presidency, but he had a lot of other challenges that he was dealing with. It's like, once he found out that they were doing the DEI training in the military and every place else, he said, this is going to stop. But of course, on day one, when Biden, after he was sworn into office, he reversed all that.
Yeah, some of Trump's best speeches were towards the end about history and about protecting history. They were really, really underrated.
Yes, and I was there at his White House conference. So, and I talked about Howard Zinn, and I was so glad because usually, usually politicians, education is boring, right? It's, you've got national defense, the economy, you've got all these scandals, and it's like, education history, that's down there. Reporters, you cover the education beat when you're just starting out, then you want to go do politics. But he tackled that. And I'm glad to see that Governor DeSantis is doing the same thing because, we've lost generations. You're not going to have a country if everyone's brainwashed with the 1619 Project and Howard Zinn. They don't. The young people don't believe in our values, in our system of government. And it's very, very scary. And they're the ones out there now working for the tech companies that are censoring us. And I look back and I think, well, what did you expect? We were teaching them as kids this stuff. And now they're out in the workforce and they're doing what they've been taught to do. And, I was trying to, sound the alarm back decades ago. And I think people were just a little too complacent. They couldn't see what was being done in classrooms. And now we're seeing the consequences. But finally, and I think we just need to take decisive action. There's no compromising with these people.
I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but it's funny you mentioned big tech or the tech companies, and because one of the materials I watched for today was Howard Zinn talking at Google, maybe from 10, 12 years ago. It's one of those Google talks they used to do. And I think that perfectly illustrates that feedback loop. So educated, brought up, you watch Good Will Hunting, you go, oh, that sounds like a cool book that if Will reads that book, I'm going to read it. And then you get taught about it. And then, he comes to talk to you at Google because you work at Google, and the loop is complete.
Yeah. Well, Howard Zinn died in 2010, so that was, towards the end of his life. But yeah, he's been a guru to generations, since the 1960s, and then especially when his People's History of the United States came out in 1980. I mean, that was, 42 years ago. And, people are reading it, they pass it on to their kids. Teachers read it when they go to college, they teach it to their students. And, and that's the reality. And often when have millennials, like my friends' kids, they won't listen to you. They'll say, it's like, they plug their ears and say, no, what you're saying is not true. And even if you go and say, look, this is where, as I do in my book, look, this is where Howard Zinn left out words. This is where he misrepresented. It's like, they don't want to hear it. So yeah, I mean, this is all a result of this kind of propagandistic education.
Well, perhaps if we walk backwards past the 1619 Project and have a look at Howard Zinn, what do you think links these figures, Howard Zinn and Nicole Hannah-Jones, together?
Well, they're both Marxists. Howard Zinn, of course, was a communist. He was a member of the Communist Party, as I point out in the chapter that I devote to his autobiography. And there's very good evidence that he was, from his FBI file and people who knew him and people who've analyzed the FBI file. So he was a believing communist, and a lot of these people were ordered, by Moscow to drop their memberships, their official memberships, and just spread the word. And he went into, Spelman College and Boston University and other places where he spread the communist gospel. He taught it. Nicole Hannah-Jones is not as sophisticated a thinker as Howard Zinn. I'll give Howard Zinn credit. He was smart. He was a skillful propagandist. He knew what he was doing. He was evil, but he was smart. I don't think Nicole Hannah-Jones is smart at all. I think she's subpar in terms of intelligence. I think she's below average. But she's been pushed up through affirmative action. But her basic principles are Marxists. She can't really articulate them, but she has this vague notion, and then she surrounds herself with these Marxist professors. And she can't distinguish between, scholarship that is legitimate and scholarship that is propagandistic. And so she attributes all of our problem, she attributes slavery and racism to capitalism. And Howard Zinn does the same thing. Howard Zinn, does it in a more sophisticated way than she does.
Can you give our listeners a crash course on Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States?
Yeah, well, of course, I want you to buy my book so you get the whole thing. But basically, Howard Zinn, starts with Columbus, with the discovery of America, and he trots out the old Marxist narrative about how, this country was not discovered at all by Christopher Columbus. People were here, and we know that, of course. But that it was his capitalistic greed that motivated him, that brought him here with his, band of men. They were after one thing, and that was gold. And in order to get their gold, or try to get gold, they enslaved the natives. They committed horrible crimes against them. They raped and pillaged and cut off hands of those who could not produce the gold. And our history ever since then has been one capitalist atrocity after another. Of course, Columbus, did no such things, and those were not his motivations. He was a religious man. And, as I point out in my book, He was trying to save the souls of the natives. And he instructed his men to treat them with kindness and fairness. But anyway, so the discovery is put into question, and then the very existence or the legitimacy of this country is put into existence because the founders really, in a similar manner, were just after wealth. And, our Constitution, our form of government, the separation of powers, uh, you know, isn't a form of government that provides the most freedom and opportunity for people, but is designed so that the oppressed masses will not rise up in rebellion and overthrow the ruling class, the political ruling class. The middle class, which of course is the backbone and is necessary, Howard Zinn says, is merely a buffer. So the wealthy people at the top who have the power, very cleverly just let the middle class get a little bit so that they're happy and they think they can get more. And they will keep the, minorities, the workers, and all the oppressed people down. So you're not going to get this mass rebellion for a revolution. And so that's why you have a lot of attacks on the middle class. And everything that has been done since then has been done for that purpose. Every single president is part of this power structure. Voting does not matter. Reform is impossible. There was no civil rights movement that was of any value in Howard Zinn's estimation, because really we still have inequality. So he says, how can you have equality when some people have more money than others?
So I'm curious, Mary, what should a single volume historical work do? Because it seems to me that some of the controversial claims that Zinn makes, some of which you've just talked about, that an academic could spend an entire career on just one of these topics. So, for example, one that was striking to me was the idea that it was America's stubborn insistence on complete surrender from Imperial Japan that led to the dropping of the bombs, for example. I think was one claim that I read of his, amongst all of the ones about Columbus and whatnot. But any of these seem like a big deal, and that you should probably spend a whole book talking about them. So, what is a single volume historical work for?
Well, I mean, if you have a single volume work of the history of the United States, it should give an overview. There's a very good one called Land of Hope by Wilfred Nicole, which is a counter sort of Howard Zinn narrative. And it's balanced. I mean, you can't go into a lot of detail, but you can sort of give the highlights and give an honest assessment, describe the principles of the founding, and go through the important events. So it's, to me, it's a challenge to write something like that than to write something on a small topic, very limited topic. And so Land of Hope doesn't cover up bad things. It puts them into perspective. And so one of the things I like to point out is the need for context, and to the historian should try to understand people of the past, not to just judge them, through the lenses of today, or, from a position of moral superiority, which a lot of people are doing these days, as if they were perfect, and given the same circumstances, they presume that they would just act so much more nobly. I mean, you've got to understand, if we had slavery in this country, there was slavery all over the world, you know. Um, and there was slavery in other parts of the world long after it had ended here and in other Western countries. So, when you look at things, in context or with a perspective, you see it in a different way. And you also have to understand that people are not perfect. I mean, this notion that, anyone that's deserving of our honor should be without any blemishes at all is ludicrous. There, you will have no one, and actually, I think in a way that's what they want. These people are nihilists. They want the power. They worship themselves. They want to, worship other revolutionaries. But as it happens in most communist regimes, they end up killing each other. Right? The purges, the Stalinist purges. So I think that's a natural outgrowth, and it's very frightening.
I'm interested in this moral lens that we put on history, this moral filter. I think it would be hard to think that Europeans living in the 1600s, say, would have the kind of moral mindset that we have today. Given the hundreds of years of anthropological knowledge and scientific knowledge that we have now, it seems like almost everybody views history in some way through this moral lens. How do we remove it? Or minimize it as much as possible?
Yeah, well, we just have to we have to teach in a different way. And my PhD is in English, so I taught literature. And I think we also, in order to help our historical understanding, also need to be reading the literary works. Because when you read literature, good literature, you gain an understanding of human nature. You have tragic heroes in Shakespeare, okay? Great men, but they had these weaknesses and it brought them down, okay? That's life. And you have to understand life in its fullness. And you need to get beyond the politics and the ideology and to delve into others who lived in the past, whether they're fictional or whether they were real people, and to study them as complex human beings. And that's one of the things that I would teach my students is, it's a, pretty basic lesson. When you're studying literature, there are simple and complex characters. Good literature is marked by the fact that there are complex characters. No one is completely good and no one is completely bad. If they are, then it's propaganda. And that's what I was trying to teach when I was teaching Richard Wright that one night. And I said he was in his communist phase because he was writing short stories as communist propaganda. And all the good guys, surprise, surprise, were communists. All the bad guys were opposed to the communists. That's not good literature. That's not real life. And that's not what history is like. History is not good guys, all, perfect guys and perfectly evil guys. It's people, like ourselves. We have weaknesses, we make mistakes, we do bad things, right? We're all marked, by original sin. I mean, if we go back to the biblical view, and I would quiz my students, and I'd talk about Adam and Eve, and so that's more of a philosophical discussion. They believe that people were basically good, and you know, so that's a different kind of theological perspective. But we need to get back to, I think, this notion that there is no one who is perfect, and to place that demand on historical figures is a very nihilistic, enterprise. We don't want to go down that path.
So thinking about getting inside other people's heads, what is it about Howard Zinn's work that people find compelling? That was a question I was thinking to myself. Does he have a style, a rhetorical style that people respond to? Is it his worldview, his network of ideas that resonates? Because even a simple glance at the Amazon reviews or YouTube comments shows that there are serious fans out there. These people want to believe him. And although these aren't users, like I just mentioned, here's some quotes. Professor Zinn writes with an enthusiasm rarely encountered in the leaden prose of academic history, and his text is studded with telling quotations from labor leaders, war resistors, and fugitive slaves. That's from the New York Times Book Review. Or Noam Chomsky himself says Howard Zinn's work literally changed the conscience of a generation, and the series of people's histories derived from this great work have provided new understanding of who we are and what we should aspire to be. So, what's all the fuss about, Mary?
Yeah, well, like I said, Howard Zinn, was a genius at propaganda, and he's very captivating as a writer, especially if you are young and you are unsophisticated, and that's his target. His typical convert is a high school student who wants to be smarter than all his elders. And one of the things that Howard Zinn does is he uses a lot of emotional appeals. He uses language that emphasizes suffering. He presents himself as this sort of a white knight, who's coming to the rescue. He is unlike all the other historians that came before him, very well respected historians. He names them, like Bernard Bailyn, one of the greatest American historians we've ever had. And he presents himself as being morally superior to him. And one of the big things I think is that Howard Zinn sets up his book as if he is revealing new secret information. Okay, even though his book has been out for 42 years, right? And it's got the jargon of the 1960s. He talks about, the establishment and the system. He draws the reader in and makes him think that he is uncovering this long hidden history that all these historians before him have kept, top secret.
It's sort of like the Da Vinci Code.
Yeah, I haven't read that, but yeah, it's like, sort of a historic, right? I kind of know what it is, but no one has known this before. No one has dared to speak this truth. And I, Howard Zinn, will let you in on a secret. And it's like, wow. And it's like, and when you get done with his book, he said, because he's said, well, if you read this by another historian, it's wrong. I'm telling you the right thing. And you see that over and over again. By the time you finish his 700 some page book, you think, I don't need to read anything else. And he's told you that everyone else is a liar and he's got the true version. And so one of the unfortunate effects is that people who finish Howard Zinn feel that everyone else is lying to them because he's told them this. And so not only have they been exposed to his pack of lies, they've closed off their minds to other historians. So, when it comes to, if you read communist propaganda, it's awful. It's a chore to read. They like beat you over the head with this jargon. But Howard Zinn just knew how to write this history for an American audience that would, captivate them.
So, Mary, I read out a quote from Noam Chomsky before. Now, this is just speculation and you don't have to get inside his heart and mind, but surely there's no way Noam Chomsky, he's a very smart man, there's no way that he could see that the lack of rigor and labeling everyone else as liars and whatever. There's no way that he could see that that's good scholarship, surely.
Noam Chomsky.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, he's typical. These people know they're lying. They know they're doing this deliberately. Like I said, Nicole Hannah Jones. I mean, she knows she's lying. I think at first she didn't know she was lying, and then she got caught in it. But she's continuing to keep up the falsehoods, so she can continue to make money and won't lose face. But academics have are dishonest, group of people. I mean, the ones who are in power and those who are on the left. Um, some historians on the right uh, twist the truth too. But, when you mention someone like Noam Chomsky or any number of historians on the left, they refuse to engage with anyone on the right. And they do that because they know that they will be shown up. You're never going to, I don't know if, no, I mean, he's a linguist, right? So he's gotten into politics. But would he ever debate anyone on the right?
Oh, geez, I don't think so. I mean, he should, because it would be a fascinating spectacle, but I can't imagine it.
Yeah, I have not been on any liberal shows. I had Tom Hartman, who is a far left guy, invite me on his show right after my Howard Zinn book came out, and I was sitting there prepared, and no one came on. And then his producer said, "Oh, there was a mix-up. We'll call you back." That was like, that was about 3.5 years ago.
That's such a shame, because some of the most fascinating talks I'm seeing happen now, like I saw an episode of the Patrick Bet-David podcast where he had Kyle Kulinski, who's a modern leftist, on there. That was fascinating. Or I saw Ben Shapiro talking with Anna Kasparian from the Young Turks, very famous leftists online. And when people come with good faith, these are wonderful discussions.
Yeah, I haven't heard that debate with Ben Shapiro, but I mean, that's not an academic debate. They're not academics. I mean,
true.
But when you challenge a leftist on a scholarship, even a simple thing like say, look, this is where Howard Zinn left out words that were critical, and he didn't consider this fact. They will just call you a right-wing extremist. You're stupid. They will deny you a place to publish. They will deny you an opportunity to teach. That's
Mary. Is it? Sorry to interrupt. Is it just like a classic case of the ends justify the means?
Yeah, I mean they want to dominate the conversation. They want the power. They don't want anyone on their faculties who would have a different perspective. So it's all a matter of maintaining power and and a hegemony. They talk about a Western hegemony, but they have a hegemony now. So it and we get back to politics. These are people. All they know is power. They, you read some of these postmodernists like Foucault. I had to go through his writing and all these other postmodernists in graduate school, and it's just awful writing. But you finally get through it, and it's like, okay, bottom line is everything is power. It's like a Nietzschean outlook. And while you say, well, if everything is power, how can you have a conversation? How can you have a debate? You don't even have, a basis for deciding on, truth or anything like that. So I'm like having flashbacks out of graduate school. You should have given me a trigger warning.
Don't do that. Well, looking back at Howard Zinn, when telling stories about the little guy, so to speak, as he does, or living histories as opposed to the history of great figures, is it necessary to tear down one to pump up the other? Why does Zinn have to tear down Christopher Columbus or Lincoln in order to tell the other side of the story?
Well, he's a polemicist. He's a propagandist. An honest historian will look at these figures and, try to look at them from all angles. And Howard Zinn's objective is not to understand. His objective is to tear down, to incite. His book is intended to incite a revolution. You had Hitler out there with his speeches and his rallies. This is what propagandists do. And that's what his book is. It masquerades as a history. It looks like a history, even reads in some places like a history, but it is really, bottom line, a work of propaganda. And that's how you distinguish, between something that's legitimate and not. And going back to that evening class that I was teaching, I was trying to get students to understand the difference between a short story that's a piece of propaganda and a short story that is a literary work of art. And you have to understand the difference. And it's the same thing with history. Something that can look like history might be a work of propaganda. And when you see the constant tearing down and presenting people and events in black and white, then you've got propaganda.
Well, pulling back to a bird's eye view to wrap up, Mary, it seems that Howard Zinn's approach can best be summed up by one of his oft quoted lines, which is something to the effect of, "You can't be neutral on a moving train." So, what's your read on this quote?
Yeah, well, that's also the title of his autobiography. That's a very famous line of his, and basically, it goes back to his notion. The way he justified his history writing is that historians should not be neutral or objective, because a train is moving along. Events are progressing. You can't stand back. So, he has this essay that he had in 1967, written in 1967, about the historian's role. he said it was immoral for a historian to try to be objective at a time when there was the Vietnam War going on, the civil rights movement, and that the historian should get involved. And not only, get involved, some historians did, going on civil rights marches, but to write history in such a way that it would motivate change, right? So, but then, once you cross that boundary, you have to modify the facts. You have to sort of distort the reality. And that's what he did. He said, time, we're going along, and the historian can't just, sit back and say, okay, I've got my piles of books here and I've got my stacks of papers, and I'm sitting in this dusty room and going through them. Howard Zinn's saying, hey man, things are happening. It's a happening out there. We've got to march. We've got to protest. You can't be sitting back here, doing the old fuddy-duddy stuff in your little archive room or your library. Get out there and march and motivate people to march for justice, for social justice.
Well, Mary, it seems that we are out of time. It's been such a pleasure having you back on the show, and we'd love to read your Skyler biography when and if it comes out. Where can people follow you or read your work online?
Sure. Well, I'm on social media. My website is marygrabar.com, Grabar. It's my last name, and you can find articles there. I have another website called dissidentprof.com. So I'm a dissident, and prof is short for professor. Dissidentprof.com. I encourage people to get on my mailing list. I send out notices about articles I have. Occasionally, I have things posted on Dissident Prof. And it's a great way to be in touch. So I hope people will do that. And of course, there are links on both of those sites to purchase both of my books. And you can purchase them any place books are sold. So far, they haven't censored me yet.
Yes, we encourage all our listeners to go out and buy those two books, Debunking Howard Zinn and Debunking the 1619 Project.
And use your Audible credits if that's the way you like to consume. They're available on audio as well. One last question, Mary, we have to ask now. I'm sure you're doing a lot of reading about George Schuyler, but we have to ask, what are you reading right now?
Well, I am constantly flipping between books. I'm reading a number of books on Franklin Roosevelt, and I'm trying to, so I'm looking at one of my books that I've gotten into. It's called The New Dealer's War on Franklin Roosevelt. And it actually also ties into George Schuyler because, of course, he was living during the Depression. And I don't think we have too many things to thank Franklin Roosevelt for, but he did convert George Schuyler from a socialist to a conservative. He saw what the New Deal was doing. He lived through it.
Fascinating. Well, that's about it, Mary. Thank you very much for being so generous with your time of an evening.
Yes, well, thank you. It's been great.
Thank you for listening to the New Flesh podcast. If you like our work, please consider rating us on Apple Podcasts or even writing us a review. It really does help the show reach a wider audience. We'll be back with another episode next week. Until then, long live the New Flesh.